all you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad, and then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner. In Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has seen, and he's made the workers' state the best the world has ever seen.
전체의 사회 준비를 우리 어떻게 정대로 지키는가를 세계여 보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 국민 백성의 영도 따라서 선군의 붉은 기 그 신념으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조체의 강성애국을 우리 어떻게 이 땅에 세우는가를 세계여 보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님의 뜻을 받들어 붉은의 정신력 그대 장으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다.
der Hüngatrik, Jejen Larang Ham Taterek, Zelzalohung Amerabotesh, Zeriasar Tolsen Yolsa.
Welcome back. It is us again with another episode of Decline and Fall with myself here in an undisclosed location of Perfidious Albion and our comrade and friend Kit Clarenberg in an Enver Hoxha derived bunker in an undisclosed location on the old Yugoslav Albanian border. Kit Clarenberg, hello.
Hello. Hi. How's it going?
Pretty good, pretty good. We are, of course, faced with a packed schedule today, as always, because as the Anglo-American Empire comes to spiral down the plug hole of history, hitting potentially the U-bend of fate and going round it into the eternal sewer of endless fast food fueled pessimism, we are faced with crisis after crisis. And none more so than where we will begin this week, which is, of course, I think, predictable, but we will get your take on this, Kit. Predictable failure or imminent failure of the Gaza ceasefire. And this, of course, links to the various ravings of Mr. Trump. So, first of all, I'll ask you the question. The failures that are now being admitted to, as we will see from the screen that's being shared here, failures of the ceasefire that are now being admitted to secretly by Israeli officials. Was this an inevitability in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, and again to to quote the mighty Chris Morris, as the news dung splatters inexorably into the events fan. The ceasefire was, yes, IMO always, it was always destined to fail. Because this is what Israel does. They have a history of breaching ceasefires always with total impunity. However, I think that the current ceasefire, at least initially, Netanyahu et al. Were probably willing to go along with it and actually stick to its terms, because as only became clear at the start of this month, February, the ultimate end goal of this armistice was a totally Palestinian-free Gaza with no Hamas and providing ample Lebensraum for new real estate developments. Which, so I mean, of course, Netanyahu was willing to abide by the terms of that, but the Palestinians, the Arab and Muslim world, and indeed Hamas reject those terms vehemently. So I think that's why there's been the Israel is clearly laying the foundations for a resumption in hostilities. The New York Times, in the article that you have on screen now, it's important to note that this passage, which admits that 3 Israeli officials and 2 mediators said Hamas's claims that Israel was breaching the ceasefire were accurate, is the 13th paragraph in this article on the ceasefire breaking down, which seems like a kind of key information point you might want to highlight as early as possible in a report like this. But yeah, so Trump has, in various often kind of rambling and bizarre public utterances, stated that he wants to buy and own Gaza. But then when asked to clarify his comments, he said, "Oh, well, we already kind of own Gaza and there's nothing there anyway." So it's it was an inevitability. Hamas are going nowhere. They have openly stated that that any attempt to enact this Mar-a-Lago 2.0 in West Asia on stolen Palestinian land is not going to happen. The Excuse me. Yeah, I think that there is a large number of different kind of regional and imperial interests, like kind of almost at war here with one another. There is so, for instance, the Palestinian Authority has been carrying out a brutal crackdown in Jenin, which is this key resistance hub in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority, as we'll get into, is secretly controlled and trained by the British. And much of their security, military, and intelligence infrastructure is ultimately overseen by British quote unquote advisors. Nobody really knows this, and it's never spoken of in the media. But what I find quite interesting is that the Western defense analysts, who would have every reason to not say things like this, have admitted that the Palestinian Authority's assault on the West Bank is a suicide mission that they are desperately carrying out because they are terrified that if an alternative governance structure emerges in Gaza without their involvement, they'll be sidelined and their funding will be cut. Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, whose own authority is rejected by all Palestinians, has repeatedly met with Trump in the past. He has enacted a highly controversial law which it ends any and all financial support for the families of Palestinians imprisoned or killed, which was monstrously framed as pay to slay and some kind of financial incentive for people to join Hamas. When the reality is the primary beneficiaries were innocent, the families of innocent civilians, Israelis arbitrarily killed. They are desperate to ingratiate themselves, and they have indicated a willingness to quote unquote clash with Hamas for control of the Gaza Strip. And I think that goes potentially beyond their own immediate financial interests and concerns about the spigot being turned off. I also think that this is a bid by Britain to, just as when Assad fell and Keir Starmer announced this meant an opening for an enlarged role for Britain in the Middle East. I think this is a yet further example of Britain trying to extend its waning international influence via proxies.
I think that's certainly the case, and the frenzied desperation coming out of London to retain their foothold or toehold in West Asia is symptomatic of the problem facing the British ruling class, and that they would basically push their proxies to the point of suicide, essentially. Yes. It tells you how bad the crisis is. And we saw just yesterday the wretched Comprador King, British appointed, of course, royal family from Jordan, good Sandhurst chap, marches to the straight back,
British Army
kind of thing.
British Army,
more loyal to his true paymasters than he ever was the people of Jordan. Sitting awkwardly with Trump as Trump, you made his usual sort of rambling threats about Gaza and basically saying fuck all. But the he must know, because like these people are like ruthless and corrupt, but they're not completely stupid. If they went along with Trump's plan to carry out this act of it's the act that people like Karadzic and Milosevic were accused of in the war crimes trial for the former Yugoslavia, but on a gargantuan scale compared to what happened in the wars that broke up Yugoslavia. This is on the par with stuff the British Empire has done before, to be honest. And if Abdullah, the wretched king, or General Sisi, well, or Mohammed bin Salman was seen to be going along with this, it would mean the instant destabilization and possibly destruction of all of their regimes, which which makes me say that if Trump does try to even appear to push ahead with this, then essentially he's going to speed up the demise of the US and the British presence in West Asia even more efficient, with even greater ruthless efficiency than Biden did. But that's the state of things right now. Like whatever move they make, a more aggressive one, a more, shall we say, tactically clever one, it doesn't stop the decline, does it?
No, and and I think as well that I mean, the Saudi, the reaction of Saudi Arabia to Trump announcing that the Palestinians will have no right of return and we're going to shunt them into Jordan and Egypt. Both governments, the Egyptian and Jordanian governments, which have hitherto been obsequious lapdogs of the US and the British in West Asia, and I mean, Jordan opened its airspace to allow Israel to attempt to shoot down Iranian missiles during Iran's first strike on Israel. I think it was May last year, or was it April? But anyway, the point is that it's like the Saudis have been put in a very difficult position, you know, as effective US puppets, but who claim to speak for the entire Arab and Muslim world. They, by necessity, had to, at least publicly, and rhetorically, go all in on supporting Palestinian resistance in order to maintain some degree of, even if imagined, credibility with their target audiences. But then, you know, and all along, throughout the genocide, Saudi Arabia was being kind of carrot and sticked and induced and offered bungs and concessions in order to sign a major peace agreement with Israel and officially formally recognize Israel and engage in international summits with them and all sorts, which would have been potentially like the end of Palestinian resistance as we know it. I mean, you know, I mean that and I think that was a key motivator behind Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. It would have been absolutely devastating. So through as I say, since October 7th, Saudi Arabia has been offered ample indulgences in order to go ahead with this agreement, and the US has also threatened that, you know, our military backing for you is contingent on you signing this agreement. Now, the fact that the Saudis have been so vehement in condemning and opposing what Israeli and US leaders have been saying about Gaza does tend to suggest that deal is sabotage now, and I think it does reflect the fact that they understand that the US and, I mean, particularly Britain, are waning powers at this point. Like, you know, and they are not the only game in town economically, let alone militarily. I think there is a wider understanding among certain typically servile governments in West Asia that they have more to gain from playing hardball than they with the West than they previously did. But also, just more generally, a lot of these governments are completely unsustainable because, I mean, to take Jordan as an example, Jordan's population is comprised of millions of Palestinians, and the Jordanian government deliberately fudges census figures in order to diminish how many Palestinians are there. And since October 7th, the Jordanian government has, on top of, yes, assisting directly the Zionist entity, they have tried to ban displays of Palestinian flags. They have brutally cracked down on Palestine solidarity protests, and they've enforced all sorts of, you know, very strict restrictions on displays of any support at all for the Palestinian cause. And there have been examples of journalists and activists jailed. I might add, in an article I wrote for The Cradle many years ago, GCHQ veterans via a contractor called Torchlight train Jordan security services in how to use the techniques of JTRIG, which is offensive, hostile cyber operations against enemy targets, be they foreign governments or just average members of the public. There are specific references in leaked documents I've reported on to planting things on people's devices. So, I mean, the only way that the Jordan's king, part of a royal dynasty created by the British, and yes, a British military veteran, can stay in power is via this Western-backed infrastructure of repression and mass surveillance. But something's got to give.
Well, yes, it has, and we will see what happens in the coming days as to the moves made by US and British imperialism via their Israeli colonial project to possibly reactivate the war in Gaza. But I would say that if they try and do that, not only is it going to cause an explosion of opposition that will ultimately destabilize a lot of not just Middle Eastern governments, but European ones as well. Like there's like the mood in certain parts of Britain is on a bit of a knife edge with all the government repression that's gone on against the Palestinian solidarity campaigns. The people are still turning out en masse for demonstrations. There's another one coming up this Saturday. There's now a mood amongst many people that there is a real need to fight back against the repression and the suppression of democratic rights, which has, of course, been taking place in Britain for a very long time. Which these recent repressive activities, which of course you've been subjected to, as have many others, journalists and campaigners. My own party comrades have been arrested on numerous occasions for the crime of pointing out facts about the history of the Zionist movement. All of this is, of course, very fitting that a certain Sir Keir Starmer is presiding over this, given that this is his whole career coming to a conclusion, perhaps. But the point is that if Israel reignites the war in a major way, it'll cause a re-emergence on a massive scale of opposition, even inside the United States itself, which I think is probably Trump biting off maybe more than he can chew, carried away with his own electoral victory and convinced of his success, and fooled into thinking there's no opposition by the fact that the Democrats can't and won't oppose him. This is a really big gamble, which I don't think is going to pay off for them at all. In fact, it's going to do the opposite to what they anticipate. There won't be Trump Tower Gaza. What you will end up with is the massive contradictions in the Israeli state being exposed again, because, as we know, their army failed in Gaza. It was defeated, and they will no more be able to uproot Hamas this time around, if they want another go at it, than they could last time. So all in all, this is loser shit, basically. It's dangerous. It's going to lead to more deaths, but it doesn't make them, that is the imperialists, any stronger, does it?
No, and I think it's quite interesting that I've seen a number of kind of like mainstream commentators who are, of course, pathologically dishonest servants of empire to a man and woman, They've been there's been a lot of scathing comment about this, and also acknowledgement, because you can finally acknowledge that the US is in serious trouble when it's not Biden or Kamala Harris in the White House, can't you? And that they have noted that, well, effectively there's no way forward here. Hamas is going nowhere. It's stronger, more powerful, larger in number, and more popular with Palestinians in the world over than ever before. Palestine has the almost unanimous, on a public level at least, sympathy over Israel the entire world over. Israel is an international pariah. Attempts to move forward with this will meet backlash if they're even remotely workable in the first place, which they're not. And it's yes, as you mentioned, that since the fall of Assad, and yes, this ceasefire initiation, the Israeli media, which even when critical or in the past of Israeli government actions, have always framed these atrocities in terms of security and defense, even if they are criticizing these moves. They are now openly talking about Greater Israel and expanding Israel into Lebanon, into the Golan Heights, and elsewhere. And that's something that I think we mentioned on a previous broadcast during Netanyahu, when Netanyahu appeared in court during his long-running trial for industrial scale corruption and graft in high office. He used his occasion on the defense stand to talk about how he brought around a seismic change in West Asia unseen since Sykes-Picot. And took personal responsibility for this. Now, I mean, as deranged and disturbing as those comments might be, even if that is something, a serious objective of the Israeli state, of Mossad, of the Israeli occupation forces, how are they going to do it? Like they got at in every single time that the Israeli infantry were sent into Gaza, they were killed or wounded in vast numbers, and the Israeli government has worked overtime to try and suppress quite how many people have died. Teenagers just fed into this nightmarish situation. A large number of IOF soldiers have been discharged forever because of the trauma that they've suffered in carrying out a Holocaust. Israel's economy has absolutely collapsed. Entire sectors, let alone of its economy, are no longer functional. It was, prior to October 7th, marketing itself as Silicon Valley in the Middle East, or the kind of tech startup center of the world. That's all ruined now. Mass population flight, because all of the settlers who were born elsewhere and have no connection whatsoever to West Asia, in any way, have fled home because they don't like the sound of air raid sirens. And so, yeah, that even if this is the objective, there is zero prospect of them being able to even attempt it. And if they do attempt it, it will potentially be the end, be Israel's end, which is why they agreed to the ceasefire in the first place, but are slowly but surely not adhering to its terms, in the hope, as before, that Hamas will make the first move. And carry out an act which they can use as yet further pretext. Although, again, given that much of Gaza is uninhabitable rubble, at this stage, mazed with Hamas tunnels, it could be a turkey shoot from Hamas perspective.
Well, the other thing is the one theory that was advanced was that as we started this section by talking about is that they were going to go into the West Bank, which is, of course, as you pointed out in a Substack piece you've written, is controlled by the PA, which is controlled by the British subcontracting from the US, basically. And the problem for the Israelis is, though, if they go hard into the West Bank, essentially that what that will mean is they are going to destroy the social base for the PA, because the social base for the PA that still exists, well, such as it is basically like Palestinian capitalists and landlords who are desperate to do business with the Israelis and will basically sell out anybody and anything and any cause as a result of that. If Israel, prompted by its masters in Washington and London, decides to go on a rampage in the West Bank and in Gaza, well, then the political power of the Palestinian capitalists and landlords would be destroyed, because any political project which is staked on the idea that we must do business with Israel is going to be fucked. In the words of Malcolm Tucker, it's fucked like Caligula's favorite watermelon. It's a wholly uninviting prospect for the PA. But as you said, the PA has no choice. It has to abide by the will of its ultimate master, which is its ultimate master is not in the West Bank or even Tel Aviv. It's London and Washington working together. So, and if they try and do something insane like move into Lebanon again, they'll lose. If they try and do something, their best chance might be Syria, but resistance will emerge there, and to a certain extent, it already is. And if they do that in a serious way, they'll undermine the puppet government of HTS, which sits in Damascus. So every success that they think they're going to get is ultimately a failure. Every advance they make can only like speed up the course of their ultimate defeat, and every atrocity they commit actually cuts the knees off the classes in West Asia who would have collaborated with them. So this is how imperialism comes to an end. It comes to an end ensnared in this like ever-growing nest of contradictions, basically, where it can't go forward and it can't go back.
Yeah, indeed, indeed, and it's also, I mean, and I think as Michael Parenti has this a great line. I think it's in what's known as the Green Lecture, because it's a very poor quality video, where his skin is toned green. But anyway, the point is that he talks about how the empire feeds off the republic, right? So, like, I think that there is this element of, yeah, as you mentioned, there's been so much meddling in the wider region, which and as we'll get into in due course, has turned pretty much the entire region's population against Western powers and sees them as reflexively untrustworthy. While meanwhile the region is overwhelmingly dominated by puppet governments who don't represent their populations whatsoever and rule through US and British facilitated tyranny. They've created, and I think that we did discuss this, that they have potentially by facilitating HTS rise to power, Israel, Britain, and the US have probably created a much bigger problem than they realize, because, as you mentioned, there have been reports of Syrian resistance against HTS, against attempted Israeli efforts to push further into the Golan and other areas. And then, yes, if Israel were to retaliate against Syria, the puppet government that you've just helped install is going to be in a bind. And that's where, without factoring in the Kurdish question, the prospect of further Turkish imperialism in the attempts to reinstitute Ottoman Empire 2.0 by Erdogan, like they have checkmated themselves. And this is a recurrent feature, because trying to maintain a system, trying to maintain a effectively a mafia system, protect kind of this regional or if not global protection racket, ensuring that everyone is under your thumb at all times is quite literally impossible. And it means overstretch and overreach. And I also think as well that what's quite interesting is I have seen this feels related to me, is that throughout the Gaza genocide, we had a kind of flow of often not particularly acknowledged mainstream reports that the US Navy was getting absolutely pounded by Ansarallah in its fail in Operation Prosperity Guardian, where a vast US flotilla was sent to the Red Sea. There was a lot of shrieking by Zionists about how they were going to absolutely crush Ansarallah, and then in reality, they spent 9 months being blasted by a wide variety of Ansarallah weaponry, including, like hypersonic missiles, which nobody appears to have been aware that they possessed. And then Operation Prosperity Guardian ended. They returned to base. Pilots complained of how, well, we've never been shot at before, so this was all very traumatic for us. And then it was rather forgotten. And then there was a couple of mainstream reports, including one in the Telegraph, and I think the other was Unheard, which acknowledged that Operation Prosperity Guardian was a colossal defeat for the US Navy at the hands of the poorest country on earth. And bizarrely, in recent months, I've seen numerous attempts to try and rehabilitate this. This wider effort, because the greatest trick America has ever pulled is convincing the world it is this omnipotent military power, despite the fact that it hasn't won a war, it hasn't been on the winning side of a war since 1945. Like every.
Well, I mean, are you forgetting Grenada?
Oh, true. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the first Gulf War as well. But it's like, those kind of those gang batterings of defenseless adversaries aside. Like there has been this wider attempt to try and frame what the catastrophic failure of their Red Sea operation as somehow a success. And there was a report in Business Insider based on a quote unquote leak, which stated that the Navy repelled Ansarallah very effectively using an unstated quote unquote non-kinetic method. And then this is despite ample mainstream reportage that the US Navy was actually spending missiles and other munitions costing hundreds of thousands, if not millions, to shoot down $20 Ansarallah drones. And it was a major problem for them. And then suddenly, actually, all along, they've had this special secret magic tool, which they're not willing to discuss publicly, which meant that they actually won. And I think that it's, this is the attempts to reassert the empire's power are as psychological as they are physical, basically. But the problem is that the psychological side is not backed by anything like the muscle or wealth necessary to actually fulfill or maintain that vision.
Yes. And I think this is a very good opportunity to pivot into the next story, which is, of course, the story of the US Empire's psychological operations divisions and the crisis they're in. So here we go. Let's just share that on the screen. So this is, of course, the USAID story. A lot of people complaining about the bad man Trump and the even badder man Musk cutting USAID to bits. It has revealed, as we have spoken of before, that so much of what is called civil society in places like, your part of the world, Kip, the former Yugoslavia, the former people's democracies of Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, so much of what has been supposedly constructed since 1991 has been essentially, well, it's Mao's definition of a paper tiger applied to imperialism, but this is like cardboard fake entities, fake media operations that are not organic to the countries, which are wholly funded by the US and the British, with the EU involved to an extent as well. Whole like supposedly rights campaigns that are just literally a creation of a bunch of exiles bankrolled by the US and again the
Yes.
British. Whole intellectual currents that were designed in London and Washington and then exported to these countries. So, first of all, we must say that those of us who were saying that essentially, like much of the former socialist bloc got turned into essentially a neo-colony of the collective West, well, that has turned out to all be true. And secondly, regardless of what Trump and Musk and the other characters here's motivations are, they have inadvertently revealed the certain realities here. But I'll throw it over to you for the latest on this. And why is The Economist throwing an absolute hissy fit over the USAID story?
Well, I mean, this is one of many kind of public tantrums that are that we're seeing on an almost daily basis from mainstream media outlets, from alleged right groups. The Columbia Journalism Review has had a lot to say about how cutting all this US funding for destabilizing propaganda operations abroad is killing independent quote unquote media. My dear friend and Grey Zone collaborator Aaron Mate posted about how the Washington Post was whining about the death of independent US funded media and what a ludicrous hypocrisy and contradiction in terms this was. And I saw someone underneath the post said, well, they were independent because they were US funded, which is, you know, the worst take that I've seen this week. But this particular article in The Economist is very interesting because what it effectively admits is in bemoaning how USAID spending on mainly exile NGOs and rights groups, quote unquote, and independent media has basically shut off a huge source of negative stories about China, which they want and need to publish on, which mainstream publications want and need to publish on a daily basis. Because that's where they get all of their information from, is from US funded organizations. And yeah, it just goes in at length about how actually in at least in respect of exposing Chinese repression, this aid money was well spent. It's quite it's interesting for a deeply capitalist and imperialist publication to be stating that aid spending abroad is a good thing. So that should tell you about what the actual objectives are here. But yeah, I mean, as we've discussed before, in my neck of the woods, there are a wide variety of publications which are or were a large number of publications that were completely funded and controlled by the British and the Americans, with EU money as well. Not a single person I know personally takes them remotely seriously. They are seen as complete garbage, just CIA MI6 propaganda. But they are a very good source of stories for the Western media on negative stories on Serbia for the Western media. And I've seen so many times the Washington Post and the New York Times and other or the Guardian have basically reprinted verbatim completely bogus stories that appear in Balkan Insight, which is this Western controlled media outlet here, and it's always referred to as an independent local publication. With zero reference to the fact that were it to rely on donations, it would last about a couple of hours before everyone got fired. And I mean, we did get into this previously. There was a extended piece in Balkan Insight about how how thousands and thousands of organizations across the region are affected by this and how terrible it is, along with a graph showing that the US had spent 1.7 billion in the West Balkan region, or the former Yugoslavia and Albania, between 2020 and the start of this year. What it's been spent on, I don't know. It's certainly not obvious as someone who regularly travels throughout the region. Like decaying infrastructure, and blocks on Chinese investment to upgrade their systems. And I think that there have been some very mixed views, to put it mildly, on how meaningful and how positive the pause on foreign aid funding is, and I think that yes, that my friend Brian Beletic, who is a very popular and righteously right-on geopolitical commentator, has quite reasonably warned that the US aid and potentially NED, because Musk is talking about throwing the National Endowment for Democracy, the avowed CIA front, into the wood chipper, like USAID as well, that this might make US operations, kind of destabilize operations, more dangerous, because now they're not out in the open, they are secret. And again, and I think that that is a reasonable warning. Of course, in a war, your enemy hiding their weapons from you is and managing to successfully conceal them is not a positive thing. But at the same time, I think number one, the fact that the USAID and NED are effectively in retreat, and long before Trump took office, NED removed its grants database from the internet entirely, therefore making their operations opaque, when their founding doctrine was to do openly what the CIA used to do covertly, and openness was meant to be its own protection, and this is how we'll get away. I mean, at the start of the 21st century, the US carried out a number of coups using USAID and NED, and then boasted about it openly. Like, it's a really good thing that we're doing this, and this is, these were effective reruns of CIA coups throughout the Cold War, except because everything was done openly, they could get away with it, so to speak. So I think the US didn't, the NED and USAID didn't optionally decide to retreat underground. It was because of scrutiny and the dissident academics, journalists, researchers, activists calling attention to what the NED and USAID were doing publicly, which has forced them to do this. So it's a victory for people power. And I also think as well that there is that you've got to, I mean, and I've included a series of deleted exchanges from a US intel vet who used to work in human intelligence. And he has now, these tweets have now been deleted, sadly, but he was posting about how, based on what he'd heard from people in the countries where he was spying, USAID was a complete horror show, and formal intelligence, US intelligence agencies weren't happy with what it was doing. Interestingly, in responses, there were other intelligence veterans who said the same thing. There was a former private investigator who did a lot of ground level work in underdeveloped countries. I met a wide range of USAID workers. It was clear that the condom mongers and rice paddy nutritionists were the cover operation, to which this intelligence vet said, they're pretty open about that too, aren't they? right?
Mm.
So, yeah, and then there was another interesting exchange where a former USAID Foreign Service officer said that 100% of all USAID project outcomes are embellished in order to continue the cash flow. So I think that because these agencies have become so vast that like it's gotten to the point where I mean under capitalism, state institutions have a interesting habit of constantly multiplying in size, right? And like they want to maintain, if not increase, their budgets, and they in the case of security and intelligence services, they want to increase and maintain their powers. So USAID was consistently just lying to themselves and everyone else about the success of what they were doing, about what they were spending money on, etc. So, like a large amount of the, and also just for to justify their existence, they were carrying out all manner of undercover ops as well, some of which got busted, some of which didn't. They set up a Cuban social network and ran a fake HIV vaccination campaign to try and flood Cuba with fifth columnists to overthrow the government there, and they got burned on both occasions. And not a great thing for a to happen to an intelligence agency. But I think that an enormous amount of what they do, it won't be replicated now that they're shuttered. And already anyway, they were probably replicating a lot of stuff that's being done covertly. And then when you can bust the covert stuff, that's even more damaging, right?
Well, yes, and this leads to like the next part of the discussion, which is what is actually going on, because like Brian Berletich and others, it must be said, insist that this is just a rebrand. This is a psychological operation, as you said, and like there are elements of truth in that. I think
Absolutely.
what is revealed though, and here I just want to bring in something I was using for a broadcast the other day, which is US's overseas investments. And I'm just going to share that now. That should be on the screen. Now, what this reveals is a very interesting story, which is that the US's direct investment abroad, of course, has been going up and up and up. Europe is a particularly large recipient of US direct investment, but just for now, what I'll show you, what I'll focus on, is the fact that the investments they're making overseas, according to the US Bureau of Economic Affairs, over the last few years have been the returns on them, the profits they make on these overseas investments, which are so crucial for imperialism, those are dipping by up to 17% per year. So that's a significant hit on on the return that they're getting, which is the reason why you have USAID, the reason why you have the NED, the reason why you have the CIA ultimately, is to make these investments profitable. If the investments aren't profitable and continue to increase in profit year on year, and you're losing market share to China in many other places where more and more countries are choosing to trade with China more than the US, and you're investing more and getting less back, that's a severe problem. And this is the reason, this loss making is the reason why you have a significant split within the US ruling class as to the way forward. Not only is it clear that the gamble in Ukraine, which is a project which has been running for 30 years, lest we forget, since the very end of the Soviet Union, this has not worked. Their proxies are getting annihilated piece by piece, and there's no way that they can continue it for much longer. And not only that, but they are struggling to maintain themselves in West Asia, hence what we've just been discussing with regard to Israel. And so the faction that is around Trump, which seems to be sort of ultra-reactionary tech billionaires, some Wall Street guys, maybe also like fossil fuels giants as well, their vision of what they're going to do is they're essentially going to try Reagan version 2, which is wholesale deregulation at home, combined with tariff walls in terms of hurting overseas countries that are exporters to the United States, ultimately only hurting American workers, though, combined with increasing direct brute aggression overseas, with this sort of and a new rebrand to do a sort of the Donald Trump version of Reagan's Shining City on the Hill. This seems to be the way that they're going with it. So it's not that there is nothing going on or it's just simply a psyop. It's a real problem that they've got, rooted in a real material reality, which is that they're not getting the return they need from the from the foreign direct investment that they're engaging in. And that this faction around Trump thinks that by essentially changing up the tactics, burning down some networks, putting in some new branding, that they can address the problem. It's not going to work, but this is the root cause of it. And the fact that this row has broken out into the open and that they're doing all these dramatic things says that there is a real crisis, because if it was just simply an administrative shuffling around or it was just a load of bullshit, then what they do is they just rename these agencies and keep them going. As it is, they're downscaling them, shuttering them, changing emphasis, changing the way they operate, because they need to revive. They need to revive their operations overseas, and that is what I think is going on. But what is your interpretation?
Well, no, I mean, I think very incisively and eloquently put. I think that's precisely what's afoot here. Is that these aid agencies were fundamentally not doing the job they were meant to do anymore. And yeah, they weren't able to overthrow. And I think that this leads quite neatly into the response of certain foreign governments to the aid pause. Is that if you look at there is a little known State Department division called the Near East what is it? It's the Near East Regional Development Fund, acronym NERD, which is little known, and it distributes enormous amounts of money to try and infiltrate civil society as much as it's allowed to exist by Western puppet governments in West Asia, while also trying to destabilize Iran and overthrow the government. And I just reported for the Cradle on how on a leaked document which spelled out the terms of a 55 million opaque grant to be distributed by NERD to NED and USAID, specifically for projects in Iran alone. And it's like, they've been trying. What did this achieve? It's not clear. Nothing. They talk about trying to use Iran's 2024 elections as the spark to ignite an anti-government rebellion. It didn't happen. And I mean, very bizarrely as well, they state in this leaked document there are a number of projects that proposals that, because this was an invitation to tender for NED and USAID and NGOs and quote unquote, and they said we will not entertain projects which include budgets for alcohol or proposals covering human experimentation. Quite why they needed to make this caveat very clear isn't immediately obvious. I mean, were people making pitches like that in the past? USAID was like, well, we'll take some Iranians on a tour of some craft breweries in Brooklyn and try and undermine the government that way or something. I mean, it's not, but yeah, the bottom line is they have sunk tens of millions, hundreds of millions into these projects that don't work.
Yes.
And yes, in many cases, replicate what is already being done. And I think
Mm,
that another point to make here as well, which is that in terms of this being a factional dispute within different elements of the power structure, you have I reported on this for Mint Press. There is a profusion of people tied to the artificial, kind of leaders in the artificial intelligence industry in the US who have just seen their entire business models and all their stock prices completely fucked by the release of DeepSeek,
mm.
which was released, was made quickly at extremely low cost by a Chinese startup for $6 million versus the tens of billions which are being invested in AI in the US, and it quickly became the most widely, most popular, most downloaded app, ahead of OpenAI. There are all of these individuals within Trump's immediate orbit, including people within his cabinet who
Mm.
previously have worked for firms that work in AI or push AI for military and intelligence purposes, who are going to want a cut of this money as well.
Mm.
But again, no matter their grand visions, they have just been significantly undercut by China.
Yes.
Which none of them, for all of their supposed artificial intelligence, now saw coming.
Well, no, and it does rather beg the question of what actually are they any good at? Is it innovation? Is it creating new and interesting systems, or is it chiseling money out of the public sector and boosting the share price? Because that's the real talent required to be a corporate executive in the United States. It's not actually innovating anything; it's making it look as if you have, and talking up the stock, engaging in stock buybacks, juicing the prices of the shares. This is the entire strategy of the Trump administration, it seems, which is that rather than do the difficult and dangerous job of actually reindustrializing the United States, what they seem to be doing is essentially just hoping that they can make the financial sector go pop, or like inflate in a massive way, get a load of asset bubbles inflated, probably engage in the creation of a load more debt, and essentially hope that what is the equivalent of a capitalist sugar rush for a few years, with no real improvement in actual domestic commodity production, will see Trump through his 4 years. I think that's what his plan is, which is why, part of the reason why you have all of these, what I would call not sideshows, but why you have all of these dramas and all of these massive announcements. Trump being essentially a front man and a hype man is essentially going around trying to create as many bubbles as he possibly can, boost the stock market as much as he possibly can, in a hope that this sees him through his term. I'm going to speculate now, there is no real plan to do what he said he was going to do, which is restore US industry, because that would mean going against the interests of all the people whose interest lies in just extracting money from the system or exporting capital overseas and extracting large profits from it in overseas. The only plan is pretty much what he finished his first term doing, which is stock market juicing, bubble inflation, incurring more debt. And this is all part of that. And it's going to go pop at some stage. Europe and Britain are already on, or Western Europe and Britain are already on the edge, where if they go, given the sheer amount of trade turnover and movement of capital between the United States and Western Europe and Britain, the United States won't be too far behind when it does. The only question then is, well, when does it all slide into the sea? And Donald Trump is hope. The only hope I think Trump has is that when the shit hits the fan, that he's gone. I don't think he's going to be that lucky, to be completely honest. But to just to divert back for a second to the various different countries that are welcoming the
Mm.
implosion of US aid. So
Yes.
we've got a story here from let me just call this up from Georgia, which is that they are now looking at this and saying, well, maybe we don't need the foreign agents law if the whole thing is going to implode anyway. I'll be
I mean, I think I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just think that this is just this is just it's really important to underline how astonishing this is, because Georgia, since the start of 2023, and I've documented this in real time, Georgia, I mean, as a bit of background, was subject to, from the much like the rest of the former Soviet sphere, subject to intensive penetration by Western financial political interests. It was being built up into a perfect puppet state for 30 years. And then the government had the temerity to try and pass a law that would compel foreign funded organizations, of which there are over 26,000 in Georgia, a country of 3 million people. They tried to do this at the start of 2023, which led to a color revolution effort. They backed off briefly and then went to pass this law again, and there were swirling rumors and accusations of another attempted coup attempt at the end of 2023, throughout 2024, particularly around their election, in which Georgia Dream, the ruling party, won fair and square with an increased share of the vote and seats in parliament. And since then, there have been, again, numerous color revolution attempts, all because of this legislation. And now the government says, well, hey, because the US aid's gone, we don't need it anymore. Which is, I mean, it is an absolutely remarkable development. They are far from the only government that has made similar statements. The Iranian leaders have said, well, now you've stopped messing with us, we can actually have a constructive civil conversation, can't we? Right? And as Alex has up on screen now, Robert Fico, anti-war, very, very popular Slovakian leader, he is cheering the cuts to US aid. And I might add that funnily enough, since the US aid cuts, there have been quite large protests in Bratislava, which is the very beautiful capital of Slovakia. I say only half jokingly, or a quarter, it's because tens of thousands of people are now out of work. They've got nothing to do else to do, so they're going to go and protest. Like the much like in the Balkans, much like in Georgia, all of the opposition, anti-government media, which is what informs Western media reporting on Slovakia, is foreign funded. Most of their civil society is foreign funded. And without that spigot, all of these organizations are going to wither and die. Pay cuts have been enacted, people have been laid off already. And there are, open calls from, say, Zelensky for Europe to fill that gap. This is while Europe is also being pressured by the Trump administration to take over the running of the Ukraine proxy war. And also simultaneously, while European economies are almost universally collapsing at a rate of knots. So
yes,
it's again due to a boomerang blowback effect of all this meddling, is it's created all of these issues, which they now have to resolve, but don't have the means to do so.
Well, yes, and this leads us rather nicely, I think, into another story, which is you've just hinted at there, which is, of course, the story coming out of the Daily Telegraph from a few days ago regarding the US plan over Ukraine, which I think does fit in with the slicing to bits of so-called Ukrainian independent media. which is that the US administration is allegedly, though this seems to be confirmed considering the Daily Telegraph is essentially a British deep state newspaper, featuring this grinning buffoon. And if you don't know who this is John Healey, British Defense Secretary.
It's not Nosferatu. Like for our viewers who might have mistaken.
It's not Nosferatu, either original or 2024 version, because he hasn't got the Ukrainian costume on.
No.
The US administration has essentially is looking to palm this operation off on various different so-called allies. So what Trump's group is doing is essentially telling the British, "Oh, you want to run it? There you go. Chair these meetings of the Ukraine Defense Group. Europe, you want to carry on the war? Go right ahead." Which is sort of what I and you are both expected to happen, which is I still expect that there will be no treaty, there will be no big sit down between or public sit down between Trump and Putin. I just don't think that will happen. But what will happen though is that the Americans will hand it to the British and the Europeans, and the British and the Europeans will drive it into a ditch. And the Russians will essentially force the outcome that they so desire. But what was your reaction to this story, Kit?
Well, I mean, I am Kit's total lack of surprise. You know, I mean, this has actually been foreshadowed repeatedly, and I noted this at the time, that throughout 2023 the Biden administration was saying Europeans need to take a more hands-on role. We will expect Germany and Britain and France to, you know, take the lead on keeping this going. So you know, they weren't being particularly covert or subtle about what the ultimate, you know, end goal was here. So this is unsurprising, but I think for it to be so such a naked rebuke, actually, it's just like it's like they, you know, it's like the captain of the Titanic delegating someone to be the captain so they can escape. Like, you know, I mean, it's yeah, no, you're in charge now. Bye, like, you know, and I think, and I have mixed kind of mixed visions of where this is all going to land. But it's like, you know, the fact of the matter is that the Russians are advancing everywhere, as we have discussed. Zelensky is slowly moving towards mobilizing, gradually edging towards forced recruitment of 18 to 24-year-olds, of which there aren't many left in Ukraine anyway, due to people fleeing or having emigrated long ago. It's their smallest demographic. It was the smallest demographic in the country before the war. So yes, there's a large number of there are a large number of issues that this will create, including potentially a palace coup of Zelensky, which might be the plan actually from the US's perspective. And I think, you know, again, as we have discussed before, both Zelensky, but particularly Britain, have set maximalist aims for this war in a way that the US never did, and they have, as we've previously discussed, the catastrophic Krinky operation, which was a deranged and suicidal attempt to recreate D-Day in the Dnieper River, were, you know, that was British planned, directed. The Marines who primarily got killed involved were all trained in Britain, equipped by Britain. Kursk, which is like, you know, just been a turkey shoot. It's getting to the point where the Ukrainian forces are completely surrounded, and you know, it's been the plan was to draw the Russians away from Donbass and improve Ukraine's bargaining position. That has been an embarrassing failure on both counts. So I think that, yeah, this is a trap laid potentially both for Zelensky but also Starmer. Now, you know, Starmer has pledged $3 billion annually for as long as it takes to Ukraine. if that there is a major Russian breakthrough and Ukraine capitulates by way of whoever replaces Zelensky, that is legitimate grounds for Starmer standing down. Because while the media might not acknowledge it, that pledge of 3 billion annually, while Britain is economically collapsing yet further. And I mean, I hear horror stories from friends of mine who remain in the UK about the employment situation, about pretty much the cost of living, pretty much everything. But then, meanwhile, while yes, Britain is suffering a very serious debt spiral and the value of its currency is collapsing to the point that it might be relegated from reserve currency status, which would be a huge blow. And yet they're going to still send 3 billion annually to Ukraine. A hugely controversial and unpopular move in Britain. And I think that this is, yes, the Starmer and his rather demonic friend John Healey might have been given enough rope to hang themselves with here.
Well, yes, and it must be emphasized if we cast our minds back to 2022 when Boris was still gallivanting around, running off to Kiev and making all kinds of promises to Zelensky. That the Ukraine war has always been as much the Labour Party's war as the Conservative Party's war. Why? Because from the very beginning, in fact, if we want to go back even further, all the way back to 2014, the Labour Party was on board with all of the operations inside Ukraine, all of the rabid anti-Russia crap. And when it came to 2022, the Labour Party leadership under Keir Starmer, Sir Keir Rodney Starmer, we must give him his full title, because God knows those women he allegedly has it away with in private whilst offering voice coach lessons to him, probably have to give him his full title. The Labour Party under him was so hard line in their pursuit of the Ukraine war policy that they threatened to suspend the whip from any MP who even signed like the useless pacifist statement put out by the Stop the War Coalition, which was useless because it essentially tried to attribute blame equally between NATO and Russia for the situation, which of course, as we know, is false. But anybody who even looked at that statement was threatened with immediate suspension. Of course, they all fell into line. Now, the war policy of the Johnson government could only work if nobody inside the political or media system was prepared to expose them, was prepared to use the platform of Parliament to talk about the actual realities in Ukraine or the long time planning of this operation by the British and the United States, if they were prepared to go along completely with the narrative established by Johnson and the Zelensky hero narrative, which is established again mainly by the British intelligence services. So without any opposition, of course, Johnson and then Truss and then Sunak could do whatever they liked when it came to Ukraine, which is exactly what they've done. So Starmer needs to have this entire thing pinned on him, of course. But more than that, it's about the collaboration with this project of the entire Labour Party. That its left and its right, all of its different elements have all lined up behind this. So it is their responsibility just as much as it is Boris Johnson's, just as much as it is Joe Biden's. And it would be entirely fitting if it was to sink Keir Starmer's government once and for all. I imagine, though, that what will happen is that this will be the opportunity to bring in the foul homunculus known as Wesley Streeting, who will then proclaim that he always had doubts about this. And isn't it better if we just moved on?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And to cap it all off, he and Zelensky will, have the opportunity to take cocaine together because Zelensky will be moving to London. But on the subject of British politicians, about which many questions abound, our dear friend Peter Mandelson has been in the news recently, has he not?
Well, this is what I would call an Olympian act of groveling has been carried out, or kowtowing. by Lord Mandelson, who gained that title, by the way, for having the distinction of having to resign twice from the British cabinet for corruption, which at that stage was pretty unique. Then, of course, it was followed up by David Blunkett having to do roughly the same thing. But yes, Lord Mandelson, friend of Jeffrey Epstein, who was featured shopping for boating shorts with Jeffrey Epstein in what must have been like the most horrendous shopping trip ever, if you can even imagine that. Now
there's something like sorry. It's just like it's like something out of a David Lynch film. It's like so sinister. It's just like as a mental image. It's just like, oh Christ, sorry.
Yeah, you got Jeffrey Epstein there looking for all the world like something straight out of Twin Peaks, gazing at Peter Mandelson, looking for all the world also like something out of Twin Peaks. So this is like some serious like fucking like uber villain shit here. So Mandelson, if you don't know who he is, because I'm aware that we do have viewers and listeners from countries that are outside of the Anglosphere, and well, lucky old you.
Lucky them.
Who he is
Exactly. Like
Mandelson is one of the architects of like the Kinnock era in the Labour Party and the Blair era in the Labour Party. He is the one of the most savage reactionaries that's ever walked around in British politics. He was associated with, of course, every dirty war that the Blair administration launched. His speciality is sort of spinning things, PR work, etc. He is apparently bulletproof because after having to resign twice from the British cabinet, he then got like a prize job in the European Union where he was a European commissioner for many years, and then came back into the cabinet a third time as a member of the House of Lords under Gordon Brown. So this guy, for all that he's linked to one of the most notorious sex traffickers in the Western world, again, lot of competition for that title. He's had to resign on multiple occasions for corrupt links to various different businessmen. He has, despite this, he has continued to survive in British public life as a figure that is revered by the Liberals. And to that end, of course, when Trump first got in back in 2016-17, Mandelson joined the chorus of screaming how Trump was an appalling threat to Western civilization. Now, faced with Trump having an unexpected veto power over his next big job, which is British ambassador to Washington, D.C., to the United States, Mandelson has performed what can only be described as a volte-face and is now groveling to Trump and proclaiming that, oh, well, we must respect the mandate given to him. I've changed my mind. I was wrong in the past. Please, Donald, can I play golf with you and be invited to Mar-a-Lago? And what it leads one to conclude, does it not, Kit, that for all these people's money and Bond villain-sized castles, the price of indignity is too high for most normal people to pay. It's only real cold-blooded sociopaths who are prepared to endlessly grovel to either Donald Trump or Joe Biden for the purposes of getting yet another government job to feel important in.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that he is far from the only that there was a mass. This has been rather forgotten, although it was just astonishing that there was like this mass purge of tweets by Labour MPs and ministers who were in opposition when Trump visited the UK for an official state visit under Theresa May, and they purged all of these tweets in which, yes, they had suggested he was the second coming of Hitler, like David Lammy and Yvette Cooper were repeat offenders in this regard. I think it's interesting that his past criticisms of Trump are being brought up at all, because funnily enough, one of the I think Sam Altman is a guy who is linked to the Trump administration's AI Stargate project. And is a big hitter in the artificial intelligence industry, had spent most of Trump's first term in office and Biden's one term in office, literally saying that Trump was the second coming of Hitler and urging people to vote Democrat and donating vast sums to the Democrats. And then you fast forward to today, and he's smiling at press conferences with Trump and bending the knee and thanking him for saving Western civilization by pledging to invest so much money in artificial intelligence. I think that as we have discussed many times on the show, the British seek to manipulate the US to further their own interests, and they try and use America, and this has been the case since, if not before or during World War II. They have tried to use American muscle. They've for their own purposes. They have tried to be Greece to America's Rome. They have attempted to steer the U.S. empire for their own benefit. But of course, at the same time, their ability to even try to do this is contingent on them being a completely servile lapdog. They are militarily and to a large extent economically completely dependent on the US, and indeed they're completely dependent on the empire to maintain any relevance. So of course they're going to drop to their knees and plead for forgiveness. Whatever I said, whatever I did, I didn't mean it. I just want you back for good. Is the order of the day with these scum. And yes, it takes a lot of brass neck and shame deficit, should we say, to perform such a volte-face.
Well, yes, and a sense of shame is a real barrier to a career in British politics, or indeed British business, or indeed anything that involves you climbing up to the rarefied and perhaps foul atmosphere of the corridors of power. It takes a sustained act of various self-humiliations to get there, because, of course, to get to the uppermost echelons of the British state, one has to be some kind of absolutely reptilian sociopath. Who's prepared to literally burn down most of the world and indeed large parts of your own country to sustain your place at the top of it. Now, talking of the horrors of perfidious Albion and its ever-growing repressive nature, we come or circle back around, I think it would be safe to say, to the subject of domestic repression. Domestic repression, which, of course, if we just look at the American case, is being threatened by Trump. And indeed has been carried out to an extent, but the British are, as always, leading the way. And I refer specifically to a story that came out this week, and I'm going to share the document on the screen here. This has come to us via former Ambassador Craig Murray, which is a complaint to the UN Special Rapporteur regarding the repression of independent media and private citizens, it must be said, inside old perfidious Albion, since the days of the immediately after October 7th and the beginning of Al-Aqsa flood. Though in reality, the roots of this go back a long, long time to the original Tony Blair government and the ever-growing list of charges or the conditions which must be the very low bar that must be met to charge somebody with being a terrorist. Basically extending to having an opinion that is different to those in power. And this, of course, has affected UKIP, and you were detained by the British authorities when you were back over here for a while ago. It has affected Richard Medhurst. There has been a stitch-up job done on Craig Murray himself related to the trial of the now late former SNP and ALBA party leader, Alex Salmond. There's Sarah Wilkinson from Palestine Action. There's my own comrades of the CPG-BML who were arrested and ultimately had the charges dropped after they tried to charge my comrades first with racism and then with terrorism, but had no evidence, so had to drop it. But this is what Starmer and, to be honest, Sunak and Truss and Johnson before him were all ramping up over the course of the last few years. Now, complaints have gone in about this, and there are those in Britain, including myself, who think it's about time for a serious campaign in defense of democratic rights. But I'll throw now to you to comment on this particular story, given your experience in this area of state repression.
Yeah, no, thank you. But I think that despite this, despite the subject being state repression of the vilest, among the vilest kind, this is a relatively positive note to end the show on, because I think that this letter was dispatched in December 2024 to the British government by a quartet of UN rapporteurs whose briefs span right to privacy, freedom of speech, human rights and fundamental freedoms. The content of the letter is absolutely withering, and there are certain passages in it which, despite being in some cases rather legalistic, I could have written myself in my reporting on the horrendous nature of British legislation on quote unquote terrorism and quote unquote hostile state threats. It's important to note that this letter was sent in December 2024 to the British government, and it specifically referenced myself, Joanna Ross, who used to work for Sputnik UK, John Laughlin, who is a long time kind of anti-NATO campaigner and authority, myself, Craig Murray, as you mentioned, and Richard Medhurst. And the letter explicitly states that we were detained in a arbitrary way, which when we had no credible connection whatsoever to terrorist or hostile activity, and this could likely does represent a grave misapplication of those laws to crack down on legitimate dissenting opinions, particularly in the field of foreign policy. And this has very obviously wider implications for society at large, for people expressing completely legitimate opinions online. I would urge I would urge viewers to check this out in full. I should have a write-up coming out for the Grey Zone very soon. In effect, the UN really tore to pieces the 2000 Terrorism Act, which it's Section 7, which is used to stop tens of thousands of people a year, including British citizens who are entering Britain. It's important to note that the being able to enter and leave one's country of birth is considered a human right under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So and that same covenant also it stands in stark contravention of the terms of the legislation under which I was stopped, that was the 2019 Counterterrorism and Border Act Schedule 3, which it contains this these Orwellian components which state that someone can be working in the interest of a hostile foreign power without knowing, or without the foreign power in question knowing. Right. So, I mean, I've said this before and I will repeat it. It is quite some conspiracy when conspirators don't know they're conspiring. This is like suspicionless dragnet style stuff in which people can be very easily swept up. And I might add that there is that the UN specifically pointed to the very dubious language in this legislation. So hostile acts and the notion, the very terms, national security are not defined under the terms of the 2000 Terrorism Act, which support for a prescribed organization is not defined. So it raises the risk of someone saying, I disagree with Hezbollah as political wing being prescribed as a terrorist organization. Well, that could be considered support for Hezbollah, and therefore you open yourself up to arrest and prosecution. It is a savage indictment of both the individual cases examined and indeed, yes, this legislation more widely. Now, I might add that the British government was given 60 days to respond, and they didn't. And then that's why this letter has now been published. But even more damningly, they state in the conclusion that while we await your response, the response of the British government, they urged authorities in London to undertake at least interim measures to prevent any reoccurrence of potential human rights breaches under counter-terror legislation, and potentially consider amending this these laws in line with the manifold issues we've identified. Now, in the intervening time, we have seen Asa Winstanley, my dear friend and editor of Electronic Intifada, be raided and his electronic devices all seized under the avowed terms of a dedicated operation against Palestine solidarity activists in the UK. Tony Greenstein of Stop the War, he's being prosecuted for supporting Hamas. Sarah Wilkinson has been repeatedly arrested and her home raided by masked thugs for her reporting on Palestine. She was initially subject to bail conditions, which prevented her from using a mobile phone or computer, which was just completely insane. And thanks to dedicated campaigning and a legal battle, which was financially supported by the mighty Roger Waters, those bail conditions, those horrendous bail conditions were overturned. And we've also seen the co-founder of Richard Barnard, who is we've seen Richard Barnard, who's the co-founder of Palestine Action, which is this crusading organization which dispatches actionists to vandalize, damage, and disrupt the operations of Elbit Systems, which is a key provider of drones to Israel, which are then, used to kill children and defenseless people in vast numbers. There was some very affecting testimony from a highly respected British physician to Parliament recently, where he just broke down in tears, describing how wave after truck after truck of children with very serious wounds were brought to him and told, well, we were in a building that was destroyed in an airstrike, and while we were lying effectively, just incapacitated in the rubble, quadcopters would descend and start trying to pick us off one by one. And this was a systematic pattern of behavior. And this is facilitated by Elbit. Many of their previous actions, their activists, in many of their previous actions, their activists who were arrested and prosecuted walked free from court because they successfully argued that their actions were proportionate and in line with international law to prevent the commission of serious crimes, including genocide. But he's being prosecuted. So while this desk was proverbially on the desk of MI5 and MI6's now rather fallen man in Downing Street, they just ramped up the repression even further. And I think that this is, as disquieting and totalitarian as this behavior is, and I think that we will sadly see probably a lot more of it, to come. As we have discussed on this show many times, repressive power structures are always at their most repressive when they are on the verge of collapse. It means that they run out of all other options to keep people in line. So, I mean, I think that this is a subject for another show, perhaps. But I mean, we are seeing a huge backlash in Central and Eastern Europe against the proxy war, against vassalage, under Western hegemony. There is a lot of pent-up frustration. The Romanian president recently resigned after a day before he was due to face an impeachment trial due to the overturning of last year's presidential election, when it looked like a anti-war, anti-establishment outsider might win. Which angered the overwhelming majority of Romania's population, including people who support the EU and NATO. They thought it set a horrific precedent. So I think that, yes, there's a lot of simmering tension, which the only response of authorities will be, brutal crackdowns. But, as ever, there are more of us than there are them. Never forget.
And that is the shall we say, the hopeful note for us to end on. And remember, as we said about Israel, also applies to the fading empire. They can't go forward, they can't go backward. They will try repressing their way out of this. They won't succeed ultimately, and a new dawn waits for us if we are prepared to march towards it together. Kit Clarenberg, lots for us to chew on next week, where I hope you, dear viewers, can join us again for more of the same. And we will attempt to end each program on a note of inspiring revolutionary call to action from now on, because that's probably what it's going to take. We will be, of course, uploading more of the programs onto the new Spotify channel, so keep a lookout for those uploads. You can also you'll be able to find more on the coming Substack pages as we sort of start to develop this program in giving a more standalone direction soon. So thanks for everybody who's tuned into this program so far. More great things to follow. Kit, thanks to you for today, and we'll return to you, dear viewers,
too, Alex.
Next week.
Yeah, take care, guys.
See you now.
Oh, Scotty, man, he had the thing of it through the Lucia, bought it, Lenin's son, they may have been able to die. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin. Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.